Police mocked a black woman, then discovered she was a federal judge. What if respect wasn't something you had to earn twice? Judge Sarah Matthews had learned this lesson the hard way on a humid Tuesday morning in downtown Charleston. She stood in the courthouse parking garage, smoothing her black robe one last time before heading to her chambers. At 52, she'd spent decades building her reputation, first as a prosecutor, then as a respected federal judge. Her silver BMW gleamed under fluorescent lights, a symbol of the success she'd worked so hard to achieve. But 3 days earlier, none of that had mattered. 3 days earlier, she'd been just another black woman in a diner, trying to enjoy a quiet breakfast before court. What happened next would shake her faith in the very system she devoted her life to serving. It would also remind her why her voice and her gavel carried such weight. Where are you watching from today? I hope you'll stay with me for Sarah's remarkable story. Sarah had always believed in starting her day with intention. Every Tuesday, she'd stop at Maple Street Diner, the same booth by the window, black coffee, wheat toast with honey. It was a ritual before the chaos of federal court, a moment of peace in her demanding schedule. The diner was nothing fancy, but the coffee was strong, and the morning light felt hopeful streaming through the windows. That particular Tuesday started like any other. Sarah slid into her usual booth, wearing dark jeans and a simple cardigan. She'd learned long ago to dress casually on these morning stops. The formal robes could wait until she reached the courthouse. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed case notes over breakfast. "What can I get you, hon?" The waitress, Linda, had been working there for 15 years. She knew Sarah's order by heart, though she never quite seemed to remember her face. Sarah had grown used to this. The polite distance, the way some people looked right through her unless she was wearing her judicial robes. "The usual, please. Black coffee and wheat toast." Sarah's voice carried the quiet authority that came from years on the bench, but she kept it gentle here. Kindness, she'd learned, often opened doors that force could not. 15 minutes into her peaceful breakfast, everything changed. 2 police officers entered the diner, their radio chatter cutting through the morning calm. Officer Bradley, a stocky man in his 30s with close-cropped hair, scanned the room with the kind of swagger that made Sarah's jaw tighten slightly. His partner, Officer Williams, seemed younger, more uncertain. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Bradley's voice cut across the diner as he approached Sarah's table. Every conversation stopped. The elderly couple in the corner booth looked up from their pancakes. The construction worker at the counter turned on his stool. Sarah set down her coffee cup carefully, her judicial training kicking in. "Stay calm. Ask questions." "I'm sorry, officer. Is there some problem?" "Don't play dumb with me. We got a report of someone matching your description shoplifting at the pharmacy next door. You need to come with us for questioning." Bradley's tone was sharp, dismissive, the voice of someone who'd already made up his mind. Sarah felt her chest tighten, but years of courtroom composure held her steady. "I think there's been a mistake. I've been sitting here for the past 20 minutes. Linda can confirm that." She gestured toward the waitress, who was now hovering uncertainly by the coffee machine. "Look, lady, we can do this easy or hard. You coming willingly, or do I need to make this official?" Bradley's hand rested on his handcuffs, his voice growing louder. Williams shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing between his partner and Sarah. The diner had gone completely silent now. Sarah could feel every eye on her, could sense the familiar weight of being the only black person in the room, suddenly under scrutiny. She felt this feeling before, in law school, in her early days as a prosecutor, even sometimes in her own courtroom. The presumption that she didn't belong, that her presence was somehow suspect. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't left this booth since I arrived. Perhaps if you could describe the suspect more specifically." Sarah's voice remained calm, professional. Inside, though, anger was building, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculated fury of someone who knew exactly how the system was supposed to work. "Yeah, well, black woman, middle-aged, sitting alone, that's specific enough for me." Bradley's words hung in the air like a slap. Williams actually winced, taking a small step back from his partner. The elderly man in the corner booth cleared his throat. "Officer, that lady's been sitting there the whole time. I seen her when we came in." His wife nodded in agreement, her weather hands gripping her coffee cup. Bradley shot them an irritated look. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but we handle police business. Ma'am, last chance. You coming with us or not?" Sarah stood slowly, her full height impressive even without her judicial robes. Something in her bearing, the way she moved, the quiet dignity in her posture, made Williams look more carefully at her face. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place it. "Officer Bradley," Sarah said, reading his name tag. "I'm going to comply with your request because I respect law enforcement. But I want you to know that this is a mistake, and I expect it to be resolved quickly and professionally." As they walked toward the door, Sarah caught Linda's eye. The waitress looked stricken, as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. The construction worker stood up from his stool, phone in hand. "This ain't right," he muttered, though not loud enough for the officers to hear clearly. The morning sun fell harsh as they stepped outside, nothing like the gentle light that had warmed Sarah's breakfast just minutes before. Bradley guided her toward a patrol car, with a firm grip on her elbow, not rough, but unmistakably controlling. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, and Sarah felt something inside her shift. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity anymore. This was about dignity, about the presumptions people made, about power and how it could be misused. As she sat in the back of that patrol car, looking through the window at the diner where she'd spent so many peaceful mornings, Judge Sarah Matthews began to understand that some battles choose you, whether you're ready or not. The police station smelled of industrial coffee and disinfectant, nothing like the warm cinnamon scent that usually lingered in the diner. Sarah sat in a hard plastic chair in the processing area, her hands folded in her lap, watching the controlled chaos of a Tuesday morning shift change. Officers logged evidence, answered phones, escorted people through hallways. It was a world she knew well from her prosecutorial days, but never from this angle. "Ma'am, empty your pockets and remove any jewelry," the desk sergeant instructed without looking up from his paperwork. His nameplate read Henderson. Sarah recognized the name. She'd seen his testimony in cases that had come before her bench. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Sergeant Henderson, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding," Sarah began, her voice carrying that same measured tone she used in chambers. Something in her cadence made him look up, really look at her for the first time. "Just follow the procedure, please." But his voice had softened slightly, uncertainty creeping in. Sarah complied, placing her watch, wedding ring, and small gold earrings in the plastic tray. Each item felt like a piece of her identity being temporarily stripped away. Officer Williams appeared at the desk, a file folder in his hands. He'd been quiet during the ride to the station, glancing at Sarah in the rear-view mirror with increasingly troubled eyes. "Sarge, we might have a situation here." The pharmacy manager called back with better details about the actual suspect. "Later, Williams. Process first, questions after." Henderson's voice carried the weight of bureaucratic routine, but Sarah caught the flicker of concern that crossed Williams' face. In the background, she could hear Bradley on his radio, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed he'd done good work. "Yeah, we got her. Sitting in that diner cool, as you please, like she owned the place. Some of these people, they got no shame." Sarah's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. 23 years on the bench, and she'd heard that tone before, usually from defendants trying to justify their actions, never from officers of the law. The phrase "these people" echoed in the sterile room, carrying all the weight of assumption and prejudice she'd fought against her entire career. "Mrs. Henderson paused, pen poised over the booking form. "Matthews. Sarah Matthews." She watched his face carefully, saw the moment when recognition flickered and died. The name meant something to him, but not quite enough. Not yet. Occupation. Federal judge. The words landed in the room like stones in still water. Henderson's pen stopped moving. Williams looked up sharply from across the room. Even Bradley, still talking on his radio, paused mid-sentence. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Henderson's voice had changed completely now, the bureaucratic routine cracking. I'm Judge Sarah Matthews, United States District Court for the Southern District of South Carolina. I believe there's been a significant error in judgment here. Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now, the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding courtrooms. William stepped forward, his face pale. Sarge, that's Judge Matthews. I've testified in her courtroom. She presided over the Richardson corruption case last year. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might make the situation more real, more catastrophic. Henderson set down his pen with hands that weren't quite steady. Behind them, Bradley had finished his radio call and was walking over with the confident stride of someone who didn't yet understand how dramatically his morning was about to change. Everything processed, Sarge? I told Captain Miller. We had this wrapped up quick and clean. Bradley's satisfaction was evident in every word. Bradley? Henderson's voice was tight. Did you verify the suspect's identity before making the arrest? What do you mean? Black woman, middle-aged, sitting alone in a diner. Matched the description perfectly. Bradley's confidence was beginning to waver as he noticed a sudden tension in the room. William stepped closer to his partner, lowering his voice. Brad, that's Judge Matthews, federal judge. I've been in her courtroom. The color drained from Bradley's face, as if someone had opened a valve. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, for the first time since walking into the diner. Sarah met his gaze steadily, her expression calm but unmistakably judicial. This was the look she gave attorneys who'd failed to prepare their cases, defendants who'd shown no remorse, anyone who'd wasted her court's time with carelessness or malice. Your Honor, Bradley's voice cracked slightly. The easy authority he displayed at the diner had evaporated entirely. Sarah stood slowly, her full presence filling the space around her. Officer Bradley, I think we need to have a conversation about what happened this morning. All of us. Her voice carried the weight of every ruling she'd made, every sentence she'd handed down, every moment she'd stood as the final arbiter of justice. The room had gone completely quiet except for the distant sound of radio chatter and ringing phones. Other officers had begun to notice the unusual tableau. Their colleagues standing pale and stricken before a woman they were beginning to recognize as one of the most respected judges in the district. Henderson was already reaching for the phone, probably called the captain, maybe the chief. Williams looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. And Bradley stood frozen, finally understanding that his morning routine of assumptions and shortcuts had just collided with the full weight of the justice system he'd sworn to serve. Sarah thought of her peaceful breakfast, of the construction worker who'd stood up for her, of Linda the waitress who'd watched it all unfold with helpless distress. Some moments, she realized, define not just your day, but your duty. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Captain Miller's office felt smaller with 4 people crowded inside. Sarah sat across from the captain's desk, her judicial composure intact despite the morning's events. Bradley stood near the window, his earlier swagger replaced by the rigid posture of someone trying to disappear. William sat in the chair beside Sarah, still looking pale but determined. Henderson had returned to his desk duties, but the story was already spreading through the station like ripples in water. Judge Matthews, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am about this morning. Captain Miller was a career officer in his 50s, someone Sarah had known professionally for years through various cases and community functions. His genuine distress was evident in the lines around his eyes. This should never have happened. Sarah nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. Captain, I appreciate your concern, but what troubles me most isn't what happened to me personally. It's what this represents. She glanced at Bradley, who was staring at the floor. Officer Bradley made assumptions based solely on my appearance and demographic. What happens when the next black woman isn't a federal judge? When she doesn't have the protection of title and position? The question hung in the air. William shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the deeper truth in her words. He'd partnered with Bradley for 8 months, had seen the subtle ways his colleague categorized people, made quick judgments. He'd been uncomfortable before, but never enough to speak up, never enough to intervene. Ma'am, Your Honor, I want you to know I had doubts in the beginning. Williams said quietly. "When the pharmacy called with that vague description, when we saw you sitting peacefully in that diner, something didn't feel right." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Officer Williams, doubt without action is just discomfort. I've seen it in courtrooms for decades. People who know something's wrong, but don't find the courage to act until it's too late." Bradley finally looked up, his face flushed with shame and anger at himself. "Judge, I screwed up. I know I screwed up, but I wasn't trying to be... I didn't think I was being..." He struggled with the words, unable to name what everyone else in the room could see clearly. "Officer Bradley," Sarah's voice was firm but not unkind, "intent isn't magic. The impact of our actions exists regardless of what we meant to do. You approached me with aggression, dismissed my explanations, and arrested me based on nothing more than racial profiling. The fact that you didn't intend to be discriminatory doesn't erase the discrimination." Captain Miller leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk. "Judge, what would you like to see happen here? In terms of next steps, accountability?" Sarah considered the question carefully. In her courtroom, she'd seen hundreds of cases where bias and poor judgment had derailed lives. She'd sentenced people for crimes born of prejudice, had watched families torn apart by assumptions and fear. But she'd also seen redemption, moments when people genuinely learned, changed, grew. "Captain, this isn't about punishment. It's about prevention." Sarah's voice took on the thoughtful cadence she used when explaining complex legal principles to juries. "Officer Bradley, can you tell me what you learned from this morning?" Bradley straightened slightly, surprised by the direct question. I learned that I made assumptions, that I didn't follow proper procedure, that I let..." He paused, struggling. "That I let my biases affect my judgment." "That's a start," Sarah said. "But understanding the problem isn't enough. What are you going to do differently?" Williams spoke up unexpectedly. "Your Honor, I'd like to answer that too, if I may. I'm going to speak up. When I see something that doesn't feel right, when my partner, any partner, is making decisions based on assumptions instead of facts, I'm going to intervene. I should have done it this morning." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not quite forgiveness, but recognition. This was how change happened. Not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in quiet moments when people decided to be better than they'd been before. "Captain Miller, I'd like to propose something constructive," Sarah continued. "Instead of simply disciplining these officers, what if we use this as a teaching moment? What if Officer Bradley and Officer Williams developed and delivered bias training for the department? Not as punishment, but as growth. Sometimes the people who've made mistakes are the most effective teachers. They understand the consequences in ways that others cannot." Captain Miller looked surprised, then thoughtful. "You'd be willing to work with us on developing that kind of program?" "More than willing. Essential," Sarah replied. "Because this morning wasn't really about me, Captain. It was about every person in this community who doesn't have a protection of a federal judge's title. The elderly black man walking to church who gets stopped for suspicious behavior. The young Latina mother who gets extra attention at the store. The teenagers who get questioned for existing in public spaces where others feel they don't belong." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where ordinary people went about their daily lives, trusting that the system would protect them equally. "We have an opportunity here to turn a moment of failure into a foundation for improvement, but only if we're honest about what happened and committed to doing better." Bradley stepped forward, his voice stronger now. "Your Honor, I want to do that work. I want to understand how I got to this morning, and I want to make sure it never happens again. Not with me, not with my colleagues, not in our community." Sarah turned back to the room, seeing something different in Bradley's eyes now, not just shame, but genuine resolve. Williams nodded in agreement, his earlier uncertainty replaced by determination. "Then that's where we start," Sarah said simply. "With honesty, with accountability, and with the commitment to be better tomorrow than we were today." Have you ever faced something like this? Share your experience in the comments. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same police station conference room, but everything felt different. The walls were lined with chairs filled with officers, community leaders, and local residents. The monthly bias training session had become something more than either she or Captain Miller had originally envisioned. It had become a bridge between law enforcement and the community they served. Good evening, everyone. I'm Judge Sarah Matthews, and I want to start tonight by telling you about a Tuesday morning that changed how I understand both justice and grace. Sarah's voice carried easily across the room, commanding attention not through authority alone, but through the warmth of someone sharing a difficult truth. Officer Bradley sat in the front row, a clipboard balanced on his knee. Over the past 3 months, he'd thrown himself into learning about unconscious bias with the fervor of someone seeking redemption. The training materials spread before him were covered with his handwritten notes, questions, and reflections. Beside him, Williams had taken detailed notes on community policing strategies. His earlier discomfort transformed into genuine engagement. Your Honor, before you begin, could I say something? Bradley stood, his voice steady but humble. The room grew quiet, curious about what the officer wanted to share. Sarah nodded. Of course, Officer Bradley. 3 months ago, I made a mistake that could have destroyed someone's morning, someone's trust, someone's faith and fairness. Judge Matthews could have pursued disciplinary action, could have made my mistake a public scandal. Instead, she chose education over punishment, growth over revenge. Bradley's voice grew stronger as he continued. She taught me that real accountability isn't about being punished. It's about learning to do better. An elderly black man in the back raised his hand. Officer, that sounds nice. But what about the next time? What happens when you're tired, stressed, when the easy assumption feels safer than asking questions? Bradley nodded, appreciating challenge. Mr. Johnson, that's exactly why we're here. I carry reminder cards now. Questions I ask myself before I act. What am I assuming? What don't I know? How would I want my mother treated in this situation? And more importantly, Officer Williams and I have a partnership now where we're accountable to each other. Williams stood up beside his partner. Mr. Johnson, I learned something too. Being uncomfortable with injustice isn't enough. Having good intentions isn't enough. I have to act, even when it's awkward, even when it means confronting a colleague. That's what partnership really means. A young Latina woman near the middle of the room spoke up. Judge Matthews, this all sounds hopeful, but how do we know it's working? How do we measure change? Sarah smiled, appreciating the practical question. Maria, that's the right question to ask. Captain Miller, would you like to share what we documented? Captain Miller stood, consulting a folder thick with data. In the 3 months since we began this program, complaint calls about officer conduct have decreased by 40%. More importantly, our officers are reporting higher job satisfaction and better relationships with community members. We've had 12 officers from other departments request to observe our training sessions. But the most significant change, Sarah added, isn't in the statistics. It's in stories like Officer Bradley and Williams, who turn a moment of failure into a commitment to excellence. It's in relationships like ours, a judge and police officers working together instead of viewing each other as adversaries. A middle-aged white woman near the front raised her hand tentatively. Judge, I have to ask, how did you find in yourself to forgive? If someone had treated me that way... Sarah paused thoughtfully. Mrs. Patterson, forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing harmful behavior. It's about choosing growth over grudges, progress over punishment. I forgave because I saw the possibility for change, and because holding on to anger would have prevented the very transformation we needed. She walked to front of the room where a flip chart held the principles they developed together. Pause before assuming, ask before acting, learn from mistakes, choose growth over comfort, protect dignity in all interactions. These principles, Sarah continued, came from our collective wisdom, officers and community members working together to define what respectful policing looks like. They're posted in every patrol car now, not as rules to follow, but as values to embody. Officer Bradley stood again. Your Honor, I'd like to share something personal, if that's okay. Sarah nodded encouragingly. My daughter asked me recently what I learned at work. I told her that I learned the difference between being right and being fair, between following procedure and following conscience. I told her that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit you were wrong and commit to being better. The room was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. Then Mr. Johnson, the elderly man who'd questioned Bradley earlier, began to clap. The applause started slowly but built steadily, not celebratory but appreciative. The sound of a community recognizing genuine growth. Sarah felt something settle in her chest, a satisfaction deeper than any courtroom victory. This was justice in its truest form. Not punishment for its own sake, but transformation that prevented future harm. Not revenge, but redemption that served everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, she said as the applause faded, change isn't a destination. It's a daily choice. Every interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce old patterns or create new possibilities. The question isn't whether we'll face bias, assumptions, or misunderstandings. The question is what we'll do when we recognize them. Captain Miller stepped forward with a small wrapped package. Judge Matthews, the department wanted to present you with something, not as an apology, because words have been our apology, but as a commitment to the principles you've helped us develop. Sarah unwrapped the package to find a small bronze plaque engraved with the 5 principles they created together, along with the inscription, presented to the Honorable Sarah Matthews in recognition of choosing justice over judgment, growth over grievance, and community over conflict. If you've been moved by this journey, subscribe for more heartfelt stories. 6 months after that Tuesday morning at Maple Street Diner, Sarah sat in her usual booth by the window, but nothing was quite the same. Linda approached with a familiar coffee pot, but now her smile was genuine, warm. The smile of someone who'd learned to see beyond first impressions. "The usual, Your Honor?" Linda asked, though they both knew she'd known Sarah's preference long before she'd known her title. "Just Sarah, please. And yes, the usual." Sarah's morning ritual had returned, but it carried deeper meaning now. The booth felt like a sanctuary where justice had been quietly transformed from an abstract concept into lived reality. The bronze plaque from the police department sat on her desk at the courthouse, but the real memorial to that morning lived in the relationships that had grown from crisis. Officer Bradley had become an unexpected ally, someone who understood the weight of assumptions and the power of accountability. Williams had found his voice as a leader, someone other officers sought out when facing ethical dilemmas. Captain Miller had implemented the bias training program department-wide, with monthly community sessions that had become a model for other precincts. But perhaps the most meaningful change was invisible, unmeasurable. The elderly black man who walked to church without being stopped, the young mother who shopped without being shadowed, the teenagers who gathered in public spaces without being questioned. Justice, Sarah had learned, was often most powerful in its absence, when systems worked so well that their protection became invisible. "Judge Matthews," a young voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see Marcus, a high school student who'd been attending the community sessions with his grandmother. He held a notebook covered with careful handwriting. "Marcus, good morning. Please, sit down." Sarah gestured to the seat across from her. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus began, his voice earnest in the way of teenagers carrying adult concerns. "Not just for what you did with Officer Bradley, though that was important, but for teaching me that justice isn't about being right. It's about being fair." Sarah felt her heart tighten with recognition. The 17-year-old had grasped something that many adults struggled to understand. "Tell me more about what you mean, Marcus." "My friends, they wanted me to be angry about what happened to you. They said you should have made those officers pay, should have gotten them fired, should have made it a big news story." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "But you chose something harder. You chose to change hearts instead of just changing headlines." Sarah nodded slowly. "Marcus, anger can be fuel for justice, but only if we transform into action that prevents future harm. What you witnessed wasn't weakness. It was the hardest kind of strength." "I know," Marcus said simply. "That's what I want to do with my life. I want to be a lawyer, maybe a judge like you. But I want to remember that justice isn't about winning. It's about making things better for everyone." After Marcus left, Sarah sat alone with her coffee, watching the morning bustle through the window. The construction worker who'd witnessed her arrest had become a regular volunteer at the community sessions, using his lunch breaks to share perspective from residents who'd felt voiceless. The elderly couple from that morning had started a neighborhood watch program focused on connection rather than suspicion. Even Linda had begun taking community college courses in social work, inspired by what she'd seen unfold in her diner. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Captain Miller. Monthly training session tonight. Biggest turnout yet, 60 people registered. Thank you for showing us that accountability and compassion aren't opposites. She typed back, thank you for showing me that change is possible when people choose growth over comfort. The diner door chimed as another customer entered. Officer Bradley, now off duty, bringing his 8-year-old daughter for their weekly breakfast tradition. He caught Sarah's eye and nodded with the easy respect of someone who'd learned to see clearly. His daughter waved enthusiastically. Sarah had become something of a local celebrity to the children in the community, not as a judge, but as someone who'd chosen kindness when she could have chosen conflict. Sarah finished her coffee and gathered her things, preparing for another day in chambers. But first, she touched the small key ring in her pocket, a gift from the community center where their training sessions were held. It was nothing fancy, just a simple metal key with trust engraved on one side and truth on the other. The director had given it to her after the first successful session, explaining that trust and truth were the twin keys to any lasting justice. As she stood to leave, Sarah caught a reflection in the diner window, a black woman in her 50s, gray-haired and dignified, carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned that real power lay not in the ability to punish, but in the wisdom to heal. The reflection was the same as 6 months ago, but the woman looking back was different. She'd always known how to dispense justice from behind a bench. Now she understood how to nurture it in everyday moments, in diner booths and police stations, in the space between harm and healing. Outside, the morning sun felt warm on her face. Not harsh like that day when she'd been led to patrol car, but gentle, hopeful. Sarah walked toward the courthouse where her day's work waited. But she carried with her the deeper satisfaction of work that extended far beyond courtrooms and legal precedents. She carried the knowledge that sometimes the most important justice happens not with gavels and rulings, but with grace and the patient, persistent choice to see the humanity in everyone, even those who initially fail to see it in us. Thank you for joining me on Sarah's journey. If this story moved you, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Until next time, remember that justice lives not just in courtrooms, but in every choice we make to treat each other with dignity and respect.